Welcome to Life Science Leaders, the series of webinars and podcasts for leaders within the life science industry. Throughout this series, we interview senior leaders across the sector covering topics that are relevant to what's happening in our industry. So today I'd like to introduce you to Mark Lightoller. He's CEO at Forex. So Mark, would you like to introduce yourself to the audience?
Well, thanks, Lister, and thanks for having me. So, yes, Mark Lightoller. I run a company called Forex now, but I guess I should probably give you a little bit of a background of where I've come from and the kind of things that I've been up to over my career. I started, Lister, as a research chemist, actually. Before jumping into sales, marketing, clinical development, I've done medical affairs. So most of my career has always been through pharma, either at country level, mainly in the UK, and then I spent 16 years in Basel, where I am now, at Novartis, and a bunch of different things in that experience, from running the global planning group for the brands, marketing excellence, and then jumping in and working in the brand teams. The last role I had at Novartis was heading up digital medicines for respiratory in that group. So that was great before jumping out and starting Forex.
Fabulous. There's lots of varied background there and lots of experience there. So obviously setting up Forex, what made you decide to move over and set up Forex?
So it's a really good question, and something that I come back to probably every day as a company owner, and thinking about what's our purpose and why did I leave what was a good executive position at a big pharma company which was doing really well, an odd decision to go and make. But a good one. I at the time, as I said, was heading up digital medicines. So we were doing all sorts of different things, from making connected inhalers. We were working through the communications on web, as you can imagine. We were doing all sorts of digital experiments in that digital medicines mode to enhance patient outcomes. Plus, I'd spent a good 10 years working on global brands, launching anti-infective products and respiratory products and other ones. And I'd been thinking about why didn't certain audiences, whether they were physicians or patients, but actually even inside the companies like Novartis, stakeholders, why don't people fundamentally get what people like myself were saying? Why didn't they do things that we said that were good and had evidence behind? And I've been trying to work out, I'd been trying to work out what was underneath all of that. And of course, a lot of that comes down to communication. Many of the people listening to the podcast would probably be thinking about storytelling. That's come of age over the last time. Maybe we can talk about why scientists need to be better storytellers or become better storytellers. I think that's part of it. What really came to me at the end was what we were trying to do. We were really trying to change people at the end. So marketing and sales and clinical communications, publications, conferences, symposia, medical scientific evidence was all there to a couple of things. It was trying to advance the science of medicine, make change to what physicians do and did, and also to improve patient outcomes, to make changes to patients and how patients were dealing with diseases, how they became sick, so going from wellness to disease, and in disease how they became better or not become better. And so, of course, inside that there's a lot of things that pharma were keen on doing. And it struck me that that pharmaceutical companies predominantly used education and information as the source of their intended change. And so I'd done a lot of my own research, again, in storytelling. Why are stories so good at moving people and getting people to see things or feel things that you want them to see in very succinct, small ways. And beyond that, storytelling is a subset of behavioral change. So it's a part of behavioral change. And so the more I dug into behavioral change, the more I saw that what we were really trying to do was understand how to change people's behavior in an ethical, good way, not the coercive, bad social media way, but in a good way, scientifically. And so I started to look to apply behavioral science inside corporate pharma in a way that we made brands, the way that we communicated, the way that we did things. More importantly, it makes you try and understand your audience in a different way. It makes you try and understand what is the basis of the choices that people make. We all have choices. So we can choose to do something that you suggest is a good idea, or choose not to, and anything in between. And of course, there's a good academic process that sits behind that. So I wanted to say, of all of the things that we were doing, were we actually trying to change behavior, or were we, working towards changing behavior rather than just informing people? So, telling people to do things is good, but it's not really that effective in most cases. So yes, we set up Forix as a behavioral change design agency to work on human behavior, predominantly in the life sciences space, to look at changing how pharmaceutical companies or tech companies, med tech companies, are trying to attempt to change patients' behavior, and in so doing improve patient outcomes. And so that's why we went out and set up Forix to go ahead there. Not a place that many people had been at that stage. It's becoming a little bit more common and a little bit more evident about what the power is of behavioral change and behavioral science in general. But we're still one of the few companies that are practicing that.
Yeah, and that's exactly what we've seen in the market, working with clients, that there are far and few between. And obviously that's how we came to meet and discuss. Obviously that leads on quite nicely to our topic of today. And our podcast is going to be about using behavioural science to improve patient lives. So this is going to be something that is going to be of interest to those in our industry. And we're speaking with pharmaceutical, medical device and clinical research organisations. So what does behaviour, how does behaviour improve patient outcomes?
Yeah, so I mean, the easiest one to start with is something like medication adherence.
Okay.
So that's the classic one. There are lots of other ones that we can talk about, but it's, I think, easy for everyone to think about medication adherence. So whether you're talking about respiratory, now I'm asthmatic, I have been since I was 4 years old, and we could talk about COPD where I worked, or taking antibiotics, or whatever we want to talk about. The medication is much less than the clinical trials that we set out, because we know that they are dedicated to ensuring that you took the right dose and you got the effective dose. But in the real world, for many reasons, not pharmacologically, it's not the problem of the pill or the inhaler or whatever, or mainly. It's usually the fault of the end user, unfortunately, us as patients, to choose either consciously or unconsciously, and we can talk about both of those, to take medication. It's a big issue for everyone. If we improved medication adherence, we would instantly improve patient outcomes. And so, many pharma companies have been looking to try and find that holy grail of improving patient outcomes through medication adherence. We avoid side effects, we avoid low efficacy, we avoid all sorts of other things. All of those are enhancing patients' lives and the outcomes that you can measure. So most of those have been in and around things like telling people to take the medication on time, even down to the digitization of that world, of putting apps together where alarm bells go off.
Yeah.
And they're all good, and they're all good starts. But what they fundamentally miss is an understanding of why different types of people will choose consciously or unconsciously to not do things. So for example, there's a theory of compensatory health benefits. So these are the health beliefs. So this is beliefs that you will create that will help you make choices, and often bad choices. So that's the three donuts that you decided to eat because because the compensatory bit is because you say, I'm going to do some exercise tonight, and that will offset the calories that I ate. Now the calories that you burn are not the same as the calories that you ingest. They go in different places. And of course in diabetes and other things that doesn't help you so well. So there's not much that we can do to tell you not to, unless we understand that you have this capacity to create different beliefs. And so if we know what those beliefs are, and we know what the underlying drivers and barriers of adhering or performing the behavior that you want, i.e. not eating fatty foods, or in this case we were talking about taking your inhaler on time. And if we know what the drivers and barriers of those are inside ourselves, so that's why we start to think about beliefs, biases, heuristics, motivation. We also need the opportunity, the physical opportunity or the social opportunity, which looks like role modeling. So if you're a kid and you have an inhaler and no one else has one and it doesn't look very cool, then you might not take the inhaler in front of other people for all sorts of social stigma status. So we have to work through those. So in essence, we start off with behavioral change improving outcomes as looking more holistically at someone's overall attitudes towards health, how they absorb information, what they do and why they do, and when they don't do what's expected, how can we prompt them into to doing the right thing. And often that requires us to be more at the moment of when people choose. So we could talk about that as choice, or in this side we'll call it choice architecture, the way that we decide to do left and right. And of course that is pretty much a micro moment in our everyday lives. There are millions or billions of those that we make unconsciously, and some consciously. So some, for example, my inhaler, I can't be bothered to go back in the house to go get the inhaler that's in the bathroom and put it in my bag, so that when I cycle to the office here and I'm out of breath, I actually have my inhaler ready. That's not usually unconscious. Usually that's a conscious lazy kind of thing. Now there are other ways of dealing with that. Maybe if I was pinged on my smartphone before I left the house earlier than getting on my bike, I would be more likely to go back and get it. So we're just trying to find some of those triggers. There may be other things inside why people don't take medication on time, and it may be that they don't believe the medication's efficacy, or they don't believe that they need to take it, or they may have concerns. So this is a model by Rob Horn from UCL looking at needs and concerns. It may be that they practically have arthritis and can't get into the bottle, and so that's a practical thing. All of these things stack up into things that aren't about the pharmacotherapy, are not usually about monitoring disease, although there is a part of that, but are usually about our own internal wants and needs, and they drive our motivation to do things. So we're always looking to see, whether we can improve people's intrinsic motivation,
Yeah.
the good motivation to do things for themselves by themselves, and do that over a long sustained period. So anyone that in your audience that's worked in telehealth will know that telehealth is really good when you put a lot of money behind it, and people dial up, people phone people up, say, have you taken your medication?
Yeah.
And adherence goes up during that intensive, high touch environment, which is great for certain diseases. But when it's a chronic disease and that's going to be lifelong, that's not possible from a budgetary standpoint from any pharma company or service provider. So we have to find ways of making change sustainable.
Yeah.
And if we're going to make change sustainable, we're probably talking about the area that's often called habits. So we're now trying to give people good habits.
Okay.
And so that's what we do. We try and look at what are those things around making a habit, around good parts of the behavior for the diseases that you have, whether it's avoiding a disease in the first place, which is obviously where a lot of pharma companies are going into well-being before moving into sick care. Once we're in diseases, how do we, mitigate some of those things?
I was just about to ask you around that, actually. Obviously, reading your article, how far back do we go with this behavioural element? Can we go into a clinical trial and start to understand right from there what the behavioural changes are likely to be, or the requirements are likely to be? Because at the moment, it's almost, in terms of behavioural change, it's with the physician and with the patient. How far back do you go with that?
Yeah. In reality, we should go right the way back to society. Even before diseases, and there are plenty of people working in this area. So, for example, in Spain, one of the health insurance companies, global health insurance companies, started to look 20 odd years ago at social policy changes around the environment. So changing the environment is a big part of behavioral change. So investing in putting better pathways that people could cycle on, parks, and community spaces, improved activity, improved physical activity, outdoor being, and all of those kind of things. So they get improvements 20 years down the line, which are measurable and economically measurable, and provide better health outcomes than necessarily building the other option, which is more hospitals, more doctors' clinics, and or more educational programs in school or things like that. Not to say that you shouldn't do those things, but that was one societal version of doing that. So I think companies that are interested in disease area strategy, which is a big word usually for big pharma companies, they should really be looking very early on. Even before we think about particular drugs and interventions. We can also talk about digital therapeutics, which are going to come in the next 10 years. So whatever it is, the offering that pharma companies and more increasingly health providers, especially in the US, but you can see it in Germany, Italy, and the UK as well, should really be thinking about what is it that drives people of different dispositions into areas where they either are developing diseases, or because they have a genetic disease or something like that, that their diseases aren't as well managed. And so they need to work out the behavioral pieces that go together to improve patient outcomes, as much as they do with the pharmacotherapy or the devices which monitor our health, and those kind of things. So we've seen, over the last 200 years, I'm a research chemist, we've seen massive innovation in chemistry. We can now tinker around in our molecular biology in a much more profound way than we ever could do. Over the last 30 years, we've seen a rise in digital technology in terms of diagnostics, the way that we can diagnose. We can now do image recognition, artificial intelligence, machine learning. We can sense disease much earlier and start to intervene with it. Then we also have to think about the third component that we're talking about now, which is how do we deal with that? That's behavior. And if we put all those three things together, then we've got a more holistic way of looking at care. So I think earlier than, as early as disease area strategy, it's a fundamental strategic capability that pharma companies need to build in, not just looking at the molecular pathway for a disease. That's important because that leads to molecules.
Yeah.
But if we're looking at total healthcare in terms of well-being and improving patient outcomes, it's as an important discipline, I think, for pharma companies of the future to understand. And then, of course, in clinical trials, we can look at different things in clinical trials. So we can look at why people fall out of protocol. How do you get retention? All of these different things, which are all behaviorally based. How do you get per protocol patients and those kind of things? So what sort of behavioral tools and tactics can we put in place to enhance clinical trials, which will make them faster, will make them cheaper, and make them more robust?
Yeah. Obviously, when I worked at Janssen, just before I left, they were looking at the behavioural side within the marketing teams and everything else in terms of going to market. And it was more so on the pharmaceutical side rather than the medical device side. So the pharmaceutical side of our industry seemed to be further ahead in terms of the behavioural change element. Is that true to say, or is there a particular pharma company that's doing it well?
I'm not sure that's 100% true. It may be from your experience in that organization. To give a little bit more kudos to the to the device guys, and keep a little bit of a check on the pharma guys as well. I guess what's happening here. So, what's working really well in the medical devices is an appreciation of human factors. That's a subset of behavior. It needs to go beyond human factors, which is usually how people could break it, fail with it, use it properly in terms of designing devices. What I think has happened over the last 5 years in the medical devices group is that they've been able to bring in patients a little bit earlier into the design process. I say a little bit earlier because I think it could be a lot earlier. And then we have a mantra here at Phorix, which is about designing with patients for patients, rather than designing technology around patients, which is generally where it is at the minute. Completely understand I have technology and therefore I'll apply it to different patients, but one size fits all approach, which is usually the problem for pharma, which is, when they talk about the patient, there isn't one, there's lots of them and they're all different, is to try and understand. Now it's more complex because we're talking about multiple different modes, but we're not that dissimilar. It's just working out what the difference is. So I think what the device guys have done well is bringing patients closer into design. Okay. Of course, you don't do that really in pharma. You don't design, you don't ask patients what their metabolism is doing. You study it. But when we go to holistic services in terms of whether it's oncology and managing side effects, which all improve outcomes of the drugs that they're being given, expensive ones. So if we're not managing the rest of the disease, apart from the molecular biology of the disease, then we're not improving patient outcomes as much as we possibly could. So I think they have a job to do there, and companies are starting to think about how to do that. Patient journey work came in mainly out of the consumer centricity mode 20 years ago. Patient centricity has come into the fore, which is great. Patient journey work is good. That's all part of design thinking. What's often missing in that design thinking is the behavior and the beliefs of the different actors along that journey. So that's something that I think is the next step for pharma to go in. And of course, the next group of people are the pure digital guys who are, who are looking at, the apps and phones and how to use those as tools. UX, UI is a very human-centered approach. Again, it's learning a lot from behavioral science. So we're now seeing less black art of UX UI, of great UX UI designers, to a more scientific approach towards here's what we understand about the group of people that are intended users of this application, and now we're designing with and for those people to help enforce the changes or reinforce the changes that we want to make, recognizing that there are different patterns inside that we need to deal with, and being more holistic, not just about education, but thinking about this easy model that you can use, which is COM-B. It's not from us, it's from the Center of Behavioral Change in UCL. But they use COM-B, which is the capabilities, the opportunity, and the motivation. So everyone, to make change, you need the capability to make change. That's the skills or the knowledge, the psychological or physical things to actually know what to do. We need the opportunity. That can be the physical or social skills. So, physically, if I can't do it, it's not going to happen. I'm not going to be able to perform the behavior. Yeah. But socially, if I'm prevented socially or inhibited socially, I might not do that. So having a social opportunity is a big thing and often missed. And then the motivation, having the reflective and automatic motivation, and beliefs, wants, needs, drives, all of those kind of things that we think about. If we line all of those up and we make sure we have the capability, opportunity, and motivation to perform the desired behavior, then we're more likely to do it. And that's the change that people are making.
Okay. So Mark, we've talked about patients. What is the view or opinions around the physicians, and how can that help in terms of behavioural change?
Yeah, so it seems odd that and we should clarify what we mean by behavioural change when we're talking about physicians. So, we can talk about marketing, we can talk about medical practice, we can talk about sales. What we're not talking about is coercing people to do things that they don't want to do. We're talking about how do we help people make change where change is positive, because even when we're talking about physicians who have trained hard and are practicing medicine evolves at an increasingly faster rate. So there's something new every day. There's different data. There are new devices. There are new techniques. And so how do you stay in touch with all of these things? People will talk about, drinking from the data fire hose as a physician, of, just having to absorb all the stuff that's thrown at you every day, with probably counterintuitive claims or evidence bases. So what we're really talking about here is to find the way ethically that we can help people absorb, interpret, understand, and then do something with the scientific evidence that pharmaceutical companies, med tech companies, and other people, health providers, are making to improve patient outcomes. Now, we all have to recognize, if we think back to the last thing that you searched on Google, if it turned up in the first 4 or 5 pieces of research, then you say, okay, well, that's true then. It affirms my previous beliefs. Yet, unfortunately, that's not necessarily how scientific evidence works. So, we're a little bit bamboozled sometimes by doing stuff in search, not to say that doctors, that's the way that they get their evidence, but it gives you an example about confirmation biases, the things that confirm what we previously held true. And if we use different ways of thinking in behavioral terms, we can think about whether we think quickly or slowly. Daniel Kahneman's work, and those things say we either take a more let's say less active and more gut feeling towards the response that we have, either towards a piece of data or to advice or to other things, versus the executive thinking or reflective thinking, where we start to question our own beliefs, our own evidence, and our own experiences. And there we start to hold data up in different ways. So what we're really talking about is providing the opportunity for physicians to experience data in a way that allows them the best opportunity, the most evidence-based way to experience the data in its fullness. So that requires more transparency, it requires accessibility, and it requires us to be able to put people in a position where they can think and have time to think in these different ways. So there are different ways to help people not get into this quick, automatic mode of thinking, and to help people absorb, data in maybe a less biased way. So, I used to be in sales and clinical development and medical affairs. I presented data every which way to doctors. But there is a bias assimilation of data inside companies, how people think about the data inside companies. There's certainly a bias assimilation of data outside companies. And so there's a movement to try and even that out in an ethical way.
Okay. And in terms of that, is that a huge challenge of trying to iron it out, or how do companies go about doing that?
Yeah, it goes back to exactly what we said. It is a huge challenge, but it's a step-by-step approach, and it's small baby steps to eradicate out of the way that we communicate in pharma at the minute, which is unidirectional, less transparent, and to find ways to allow physicians to absorb data and to get into that mindset. So you're starting to see those things, but it's a change in the mindset of the way that we present data, and we give people the opportunity to be able to see what the effect of that data is, and those ways. Publications on their own are part of it. Publications are changing their accessibility behind firewalls, and so on and so on. But even it comes down to data visualization. So it's as simple as can be as simple as looking at the way that we create scientific graphs and charts. Working out how physicians in that modality need to absorb data is really important, because if we get the first visual piece wrong, then we have very little hope of getting people to understand and internalize that without putting up barriers to what they would hold as a conventional wisdom.
Okay, fabulous, thank you. So what about keeping patients in clinical trials?
Well, so this is a really interesting group of things. So lots of things going on here. We blend a lot here with digital tools. So there's a model that you can run at just about everything, which becomes really clear when you start to think about it. So people will do what is familiar, what is easy, and what is beautiful.
Yeah.
We all know we all know all of this. It's just that we don't do it all the time. And so if you're trying to make a clinical trial protocol that a patient has to do something inside, the questions that you're asking yourself is how familiar would this or unfamiliar would this be to them, and how more familiar can I make it? That can be the setting, what the paperwork looks at, who delivers the paperwork, how it's the things that I'm asked to do, the number of times I'm asked to do them. So how familiar, how easy is it to do? Now, if you're asking, I used to do CRFs on, triple carbon paper in those worlds. Those days have gone.
You're showing your age now, Mark.
Yeah, unfortunately, I am. But much of the data that we ask people to fill in forms and web and things like that are already available. So those services, and they're usually not in pharma, they're usually in consumer world, where something feels frictionless and easy.
Yeah.
And it just pulls you with it, and you go with it because it just feels nice. It's even better if it looks good as well. And so unfortunately, the clinical trial teams of the world have not put beauty as part of their design function. It's usually functional before the aesthetics.
Sure.
We're now learning that if you're going to be patient facing and getting more people to recruit, stay in recruitment and those kind of things, we have to focus on some of these things. So every time we communicate, we can think of this model called Create, and it's around the cues that people get, how they see it, and what they're asked to do, their reaction to it, whether it's going to be positive or negative, how they evaluate it, the action that they get, the timing. So can I do it now? And that's usually around the urgency. So if there's not and again, going back to our web friends, if there's no call to action at the end of a communication, we're less likely to do something and it gets buried. So even in clinical trials, just the way that we communicate with patients will help with retention. Digital tools that make it feel easy, natural, and bring people along the process. Avoid all the redundant things that they don't need to do, and help focusing on getting the action that they want, which is taking a medication, agreeing to doing the study, reading the information accurately, and doing consent. These days, often e-consent, so that's even worse because we need to make sure that people understand. We can apply great communication skills that we're learning that have behavioral change as part of their basis into clinical trials. We're starting to see those, along with some other tools and algorithms that keep people moving, can enhance the patient retention, which again, faster trials, cheaper trials, medicine faster to market, all good for everyone.
Thanks, fabulous. So how do you use the behaviour change inside pharma?
So we help pharma in a couple of different ways. Quite often we are looking at brands or disease areas, and we're looking at their strategic plans. We're looking at those strategic plans and then looking downstream and saying, how are you going to execute that strategy? What do you need to do to execute that strategy? And at that stage, we're holding a behavioral lens to the people that are going to need to change to do something. So that's either take a medication, deliver a medication, or whatever it is. Usually someone's got to change doing something for that brand strategy to work. But by looking at it with a behavioral lens, we're able to go back, and usually the strategy is well written, but the way that it's executed isn't necessarily targeted towards changing behavior. And then, so we can identify what we might do more holistically to think about how to make that strategic change happen. And then we're helping companies prototype communications. So we use all sorts. We're media agnostic in terms of our approach. We will either create visual, verbal language. So, we work in a lot of research tools like metaphor and linguistics to understand what people are saying, especially for patients. So if people don't have a framework to explain what they are going through, they'll often use figurative language, which is, similes or metaphors. And we use those to help people understand. That then helps us create visual tools. And visual tools are as much as part of anything. And then we use film, we use augmented reality, we use virtual reality, changing the environment, changing the visualization. Again, good tools to help people see things in different ways, or to maybe think about things in a different way. And connecting those two worlds together. So looking strategically, and then looking at how to intervene and make those behavioral change interventions work. And so we kind of work across the continuum there.
Fabulous. So just looking into the future, what does this space look like if we're looking ahead of ourselves in organisations? What should they be thinking about now? What will their teams look like? What talent do they need to be bringing in to their organisations to ensure that they are where they need to be in the coming years?
Yeah, I mean, I think behavioral change is a capability that pharma companies need to instill. They need to build into their teams. It can either be a function or it can be part of training, and so it's not the role of just the marketing teams. It's the role of different team members across a cross-functional team to have that. So I think it's well understood that pharma companies need to be patient-centric. I think what this is what does patient-centric actually mean? And behavioral change gives you a set of tools that help you be patient-centric. So it may be just unlocking a set of tools to a group of people who are already thinking about how to be more patient-centric. The skill sets that people will obviously need to develop are how to look at and listen to patients, but also physicians, other stakeholders, so family members, will be the environment around them, so it can be government, schools, hospitals, the infrastructure that goes around people. So that kind of anthropological ethnographic approach, I think, needs to be built further inside the teams and not just inside agencies. Yeah. We're an agency, but I think it needs to go deeper than inside an agency. So there's an appreciation of what to look for and how you can use it. I think behavioral science has been a bit of a black box up until now, with a set of tools that not many people understood. I think it's becoming more accessible for the everyday pharma professional to think about, use, and work out how to improve their products and services with, and I think that needs to be taught and it needs to be built in. So I can see that in the future we will have groups of people focused on the pharmacotherapy, groups of people focused on devices and digital technology to help monitor people, and I think we'll have groups of people who are, looking at key stakeholders and trying to understand their drivers' wants, needs, and beliefs, and they will be held equally as important. Because right at the end of it, if we fail to change people, if we fail to change the way that they do things, we've failed the strategy totally. And pharmaceutical products on their own don't do that. It's the product, it's the services, the communication, and everything else that goes around that package that helps people support and make that change.
Indeed. Obviously, the end goal is to improve patients' lives. Yep. How are organisations measuring the success of this process?
That's a really good question, and a pause of how to answer that. So for sure, patient outcomes, the improvement of patient outcomes is being measured, way better than it was 10, 15 years ago. So we're no longer looking purely at clinical trials as the marker of disease outcome. We're looking at real world studies. So we're looking at what happens when it goes into people's homes and what people do. And so people are making good progress inside that. Digital tools are helping people be able to collect data inside that. Machine learning allows us to look at unstructured data where we couldn't look at voice diaries or we couldn't look at written diaries so well before. Now we can process a lot more of that and get deeper insights into that. I think there are a couple of pieces that probably are evolving in that space. So there's efficacy. what the products do themselves. There's efficiency. So what does that create more than that? So quality of life. So people have invested a lot in PROs and EPROs and quality of life instruments. So they're looking more holistically at not just what does it do to my biology, but what does that give me in terms of quality of life. So that's been a good process that's going forward. Now I think we add one more onto that. So we would call that kind of E3, so efficacy, efficiency, and experience. So now we're also looking at the total patient experience, because we can, in something like interstitial lung disease or pulmonary arterial hypertension or those kind of things, we can improve patient biology and their outcomes from that. We can see that there are changes in quality of life, yet we may not have focused on improving the overall experience of being treated, managed, and living with the disease. And I think when you put that third part in, that's really when we get more holistic about improving patient outcomes. And is the role and responsibility not just of pharma, but of a group of people. But pharma are going to be really good, and medtech are going to be really good at understanding the data and being able to help improve patient outcomes there. Inside that experience lies a lot of behavior. And so that's why we focus in that area, because we think that's the kind of the third age of patient outcome to come. First age, pharmacotherapy. Second age, PROs and quality of life, and exploring that. Third age is patient experience.
Fabulous. Thank you. We're going to run out of time, but just before we go, I wanted to understand a little bit more about your journey and building your company in an area where there was no demand for this service. So it'd be keen, I know we touched on it a little bit at the beginning, but just a little bit about your journey of where you've come from and where you are today, and challenges, and also
it's a bit of a gamble, really, isn't it?
And also, your wins and how everything's going.
No, bit of a gamble. Like we said at the start, it's an odd day you walk into HR at a big company and you say, I'm going to leave, when they haven't asked you to. And you say, right, I'm going to go and set up a company. And they say, what in? And you say, well, behavioral change. And they say, well, we don't have a department for that. And I said that I know that's the point. I think that in 5 years' time, that you'll need one, and that this will be something that that people will see that the money that they've spent on marketing and communications and many of the tools and devices are less effective than they think they are right now, and it will become apparent. I think we're in that age now where CFOs are looking at some of the spend in pharma and thinking, why are we doing this? Simply because, and the pandemic will tell you this as well, when we turn those activities off, we don't change anything really in terms of patient outcomes. So not to say that they're not important, but they may not be as important as we think they are. And that was my thought process, which is I can't see this happening at the company that I was at. I think it's an opportunity to go build something. So how do you go build that? So I went back and did some executive education in behavioral science to keep the science piece as current. I'm not a psychologist, but we do have that experience of bringing in some of the more modern tools, techniques, and theories and tools into this space, blended with my experience of working in pharma and as a scientist too, makes a great thing. But yet, then we have to define a proposition and a company, and then get clients and do those kind of things, and it's a slow process. So we're still on that journey. We're 5 years in. We are increasingly refining our proposition. and it's becoming more obvious and more evident that our needs meet our skills meet the needs of companies, and I think that's has been our biggest challenge, which is we understand what you're doing, but we don't see that we need it. Mm-hmm. Now we understand what you're doing and we see that we need it.
Yeah.
Which is always waiting for the wave to catch up with where we were. So I'm not a betting man generally, but I'm hoping this one bet does work. But in the meantime, what we have done is had amazing conversations with amazing people in pharma and medtech and beyond, to be honest, outside of the life sciences area. Whenever we engage someone at the level of talking about humans and about why humans do what they do, people are always engaged. If we move that into a business conversation in the next 2 or 3 years, then I think we're really talking. So it's been super interesting being after 20 odd years being in big pharma, taking that experience out and building your own company with all the trials and tribulations, with self-funding. We've not had any VC money in. We've grown every year. We've grown our staff. We're not very big, but we've grown step by step with new clients that we've built on. And of course, now we're on the entrepreneurial big question of scale. So that's our next challenge. How do we scale?
Of course. Well, it's exciting times ahead, isn't it? And you've all achieved so much already. And be working in this market, there is definitely a need for an organisation such as yours within the industry. So hopefully everything should be as it pans out. But I know everybody that listens to us will have thoroughly enjoyed our conversation today. It's definitely a topic that people are interested in. And if anybody has any questions or would like to reach out to Mark directly, then please feel free to do so. And there'll be more podcasts coming through later on. So thank you very much. Thanks, Mark, for all your time. I really do appreciate it.
Thanks very much.